Well, welcome to another conversation that we're having on sexuality this time, the Shalom of Sexuality. And as I've joked with several folks that I was a chicken to preach on this, and so I thought I'd bring in some backup. Not really a chicken, just not sure in our current context of how to do this well. And so I reached out to a friend and a local member of our presbytery, Jim Weidenaar, and he's with Harvest USA, and he's going to be here for the next hour or so, maybe not quite that long, maybe a little longer. We'll see how the conversation goes, and he's going to help us think through this topic of sexuality. It's a broad and deep topic. It's one that our culture is struggling with, and one that, quite frankly, I think the church struggles with as well. And so, Jim, it's great to have you.
Thank you.
Part of this conversation, and we'll kind of jump right in here, and just to get to know you a little bit for the folks from Covenant Community and maybe others who are watching this online. Could you give us a little bit about your story and kind of what brought you to where you are today?
My story, how broadly?
Just, something that help us kind of know you a little bit.
Sure.
Don't have to go too deep.
Yeah, I grew up in Michigan, outside of Detroit. I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church, which is a kind of a Dutch Reformed branch, and went to Calvin Seminary and then Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia, and got a PhD at Westminster. Joined the PCA when we moved to Philadelphia in 2002, and we were there until 2012 when I started working with Harvest USA and came here to Pittsburgh. I have a wife and one daughter. She's 13, and that's about it.
Great. That's, I think, a little helpful background. So I've mentioned Harvest USA. You mentioned Harvest USA. What is Harvest USA?
Harvest USA is a ministry, nonprofit ministry that works with people who are struggling with sexual sin of various kinds. It was started in 1983 as a ministry of 10th Presbyterian Church in Center City, Philadelphia. At that time, it was a response to the fact that there's a very large, vibrant gay community right around the church. And James Montgomery Boyce was the pastor at that time, and they wanted to decide what do we do about the gay community that's right on our doorsteps. They decided to start a Bible study, offering that to that community, and advertised it, and got a good response. I don't know the specifics of that, but then the significant thing was within a fairly short period of time, the direction, the focus of Harvest USA expanded to not just be people who are struggling with same-sex attraction or homosexuality, but any type of sexual sin, what we might call sexual addiction, basically entrenched sexual struggles of various kinds, and their families, women who are struggling, wives of strugglers. So that was the Harvest USA focus for a good several years of their beginning of their ministry. And then at some point, the leadership of Harvest USA became convinced that this was something that, because it was a gospel issue, it belonged to the church, and the church should be able to do this. Obviously, the ministry started in a church. At some point, 10th had allowed Harvest to go off on its own as a separate parachurch organization, but Harvest had on its heart to equip the church to do this. So now Harvest has a twofold focus, continuing to help individuals and do direct ministry with individuals, as well as producing resources to help equip the church to do this kind of work.
Yeah, that's, I think, important. That's one thing that has, I think, really been helpful for us personally as a congregation. Before COVID shut us down, we were going through Godly Sexuality, the DVD series that Harvest had produced several years ago, which in our adult Sunday school class, which was really good. And our church has begun supporting the ministry of Harvest financially, and our presbytery does as well. So it's a good ministry that maybe you, as part of Covenant Community, aren't fully aware of what Harvest is and does, and how we as a church have benefited from your ministry. So how did you end up with Harvest?
My own personal experience was as a young man getting hooked on pornography, and then that came out when I was engaged to be married, and it was a rather traumatic thing. And that was the beginning of really the serious discipline of God on me, and God helping me to grow in that area, to bring that to the gospel, and something that's been very important to me and my wife, our whole married life, in terms of working through that and growing in that in holiness. And so it was something also, being a seminarian, it became a topic for a lot of my papers and my thoughts, because that's what was personally the most important aspect of Christian growth for me. So that was the background story. And then we were attending 10th while I was at Westminster. And so we heard of Harvest USA. We saw a Sunday school series done by Harvest USA and a seminar here and there, and really liked what we heard. And after I finished my doctoral studies, we were trying to figure out what to do with it, and trying to think outside the box and pray, what would God have us do? And it's the kind of thing where I would have an idea, and Deb, my wife, would be, she would have an idea, and I would be not so sure about it. And this was one where one day I said, what about Harvest USA? And immediately she said, yes, that's right. So then I contacted John Freeman, and we met, and there was just a good rapport. And before I knew it, here I was in Pittsburgh.
And how long have you been here in Pittsburgh?
Since 2012.
And with Harvest the entire time?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, hopefully that gives you all a little bit of background of Harvest and Jim personally, and we're gonna jump off here and kind of go into some other areas as well. So, getting this information about who you are and Harvest, hopefully that helps you understand why I invited Jim today for this conversation, and I'm very hopeful that he can help us think biblically and Christianly about our sexuality, and get a picture of what of the way it's meant to be. As we've talked about that in our series, Shalom in the Home and everywhere else, we've been looking at what is this idea of shalom that the Hebrew prophets talk about, and that all areas of life have aspects to them that are not the way they're supposed to be, and what does that look like for us, and how does Christ redeeming work bring about that fulfillment of shalom, both in the present but ultimately fully in the future. So to get to there, we got to start at the beginning. And can you help us think about sex and sexuality from a biblical perspective? Where do we begin? How do we think about this? Obviously, kind of setting you up for what does God in creation and then throughout Scripture tell us? How is our sexuality created good?
Maybe I was going to say obviously, maybe it's not so obvious, but we start with creation, God making everything and making it good, making it, especially with the human part, making it very good, male and female, very good. And so we see at the very beginning, God making Adam and Eve and saying, let us, we made man in our image, in the image of God. He created them, male and female. He created them. There's a beginning hint at marriage there, even more than a hint. Male and female, he created them. It's so obvious that we sometimes miss it. There it is right there. God made marriage, and with marriage, he makes sexuality, and they're really inseparable. And you see right from the beginning this phrase, therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That phrase, the two shall become one flesh, is something we see a few times showing up in the scriptures. And the one thing that we can see by the way it's used is that it refers not only to kind of the metaphorical one flesh of, a relationship where you share a checkbook or, that kind of thing, but you also share a bed. And so it has that one flesh meaning in a much more literal way as well. Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians 6 to describe in some way what happens when a man has sex with a prostitute. In a way that does not fit the way it's designed to be, but yet it's clear that the two shall become one flesh for him. There's something with what this man is doing with the prostitute that matches up with the two shall become one flesh. And so you see that phrase beginning there in Genesis, but at that point, it's all very good. It's all very good. And even the other place you see it is what we call the cultural mandate, which I don't particularly like that phrase because a mandate sounds like somebody with their finger saying, you must do this. And really what it is a blessing. God blessed them and said to them, and you could understand the Hebrew there, the parallelism, as God blessed them by saying to them. So this is a blessing. Blessings were in the imperative voice. Be fruitful and multiply.
It's like God's benediction.
That's right. God's benediction. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. And of course, you can't be fruitful and multiply without sex. And so here we have in Genesis male and female imaging God, and even a hint there that there's something about the sexuality of male and female, that binary, that images God. It's very good, and it is the source of great blessing on the earth.
So what you're saying is that sex and sexuality are good things.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Just
wanted to make sure that, because I think, unfortunately, I think a lot of times for those who have grown up in the church, or for those who have even just maybe recently come to Christ and are in the church, there's a sense, whether from our culture or even from the church sometimes, that maybe sex is just, it's not something that's ultimately good, right? It's kind of a lesser, a lesser urge or a lesser part of who we are as
and
beings.
Some people, I think, take that from. There's a lot of strains in the history of thought that have kind of sometimes affected Christian thought that sees physical things as bad and the spiritual things or intellectual things as the things of real value. And so sexuality is experienced as something that's very physical and earthy, something we have in common with the animals. But I think, the picture in Genesis is that we are images, we image God as embodied souls. Or as ensouled bodies, whichever way you put it, we're whole people. Right. Jesus has a body right now and will for all eternity have a human body in the flesh, resurrected, glorified flesh, as we will have as well. So I think we have to fight against that idea that, okay, this is fleshly, this is physical, this is animal. So it's part of the lesser part of our nature. That's not a biblical way of viewing things.
Good. And so with that, understand that God created our sexuality, created sex as very good. What is the design of sex in Scripture?
Well, I think, you see little hints in Genesis of what the design is, but I think if we really want to understand the full design of sexuality, we see in the whole scriptures where it comes up again and how God uses it in the rest of the revelation of himself. And one way that I have done this personally is done a study of, that phrase, the two shall become one flesh. Where do we see it again? Where does it come up again, in what context? So we see it, of course, in Genesis when it starts. And then we see it in the New Testament, we see it in the Gospels, Mark 10 in particular, where Jesus is asked about divorce. So this is a question about marriage. And we see it in 1 Corinthians 6 that I already mentioned, where Paul's talking about sexual immorality. And we see it in Ephesians 5. And especially and explicitly in 1 Corinthians 6 and in Ephesians 5, a connection is made to union with Christ. And Paul even goes so far as to say, after mentioning the two shall become one flesh, he's saying, this is a mystery, but I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. And that shouldn't be a surprise to us, because throughout the Old Testament, God's people are described as God's bride over and over again. God is the husband, Israel is the bride, and he loves her like a husband. That is a theme that we also see in the New Testament, where the church as the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation comes down out of heaven as a bride adorned for her husband. And again, you can think, well, that's marriage, not sex. But biblically, you can't think of marriage as disconnected from sex. You certainly can't think of sexuality, the way God designed it, as separate from marriage. It's the physical manifestation of the union that marriage is, that is a picture of Christ in the church.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So, obviously, we don't experience that the way that it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so we see that in what we call the fall, we see sin entering the world, and how has our sexuality been distorted by sin? This may be
Right.
an almost laughable question, but
Yeah.
Can you help us
Right.
think through that?
Right. Well, the way we talk about this at Harvest USA is we describe the fall into sin as being fundamentally a fall that affects us in our hearts. Not, of course, our physical hearts, but the biblical understanding of heart as the center of our affections and thoughts and motivations. And our central desire in a sinful situation, a sinful condition, our central desire is autonomy from God. And so that really affects every aspect of our life. And it certainly also affects sexuality. So sexuality no longer is a receiving of a blessing from God under his authority, trusting in him, done according to his direction. It is each individual human taking control of his or her life, saying, I make the rules, I decide what's right. Basically, the life according to Disney. I look inside myself and follow my heart and determine my destiny. And that creates all kinds of problems, all kinds of brokenness. It really turns sexuality completely on its head, because it makes it, in the end, it makes it an anti-gospel picture rather than a gospel picture.
Can you tease that out a little bit?
Okay. I was hoping you would ask me that. So, if we were to look at some of the passages where the two shall become one flesh are used, and I've mentioned them already, there's a lot that we could say, more than just that sexuality or sex in marriage sex, maybe you want to make a hyphenated word there, marriage sex, because there is nothing else in God's design but marriage sex. How that pictures union with Christ. I'll just pick out three things. One is from the passage about divorce. Sexuality is to be grounded in permanence. So the idea that marriage, the only context for sexuality, was supposed to be something that was not temporary, not ending, for the entire extent of this life, which is the realm in which marriage exists. It was to be a sure thing and permanent. And the way that connects to the gospel and to union with Christ is that, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, So as Christ was risen from the dead, so we also will be risen with Christ. And he says that in this context of sexuality. This idea that we are, when we're united to Christ, we are connected, we are grounded, you might say we're grounded eschatologically. We're grounded to the permanence of a future hope that cannot be taken away. We're not concerned that we're going to lose this. We're not concerned that, well, he's going to change his mind. We're not concerned that he's going to dump us if we don't perform well. So if you think about the effect that aspect in and of itself has on our understanding of salvation, that we have this security and this hope that I'm united to Christ. It's not just that I'm forgiven now for the moment, but I am locked in. I am anchored in a glorious future that's like if I'm mountain climbing and I have a belay that's connected me to a higher point, I'm going to get there because I'm connected to that higher point. And so that affects our Christian life in many ways. We're confident. We're not on pins and needles thinking that we're going to mess up so bad that God's going to turn his back on us. There's a peace and a freedom in our growing in love with our Savior. The same way, the permanence that is the designed context for sexuality has a similar effect on sexuality. Sexuality that is grounded in marital commitment and permanence is a sexuality that is free from the demand, the anxiety of performance. Am I going to mess this up? Am I going to lose this if I don't excel, if I don't impress my mate at every moment? Whereas sex that is fallen, that is disconnected from that, we know where that goes. The one-night stand, the hookup culture, even, whatever it is, it's fraught with heartache. It's fraught with stress. It's fraught with anxiety. It brings depression. It brings self-hatred. It brings self-doubt. What the world is offering as something that's very good, which is this one-night stand type of value, in actuality, it makes us miserable. And it makes sexuality, it makes sex miserable. That's just one. That's grounded in permanence. And I think as we talk further, we'll bring out some other aspects.
I think that's really helpful to see that as a gospel issue. I think I've already kind of maybe touched on this a little bit, but how do we use sex in light of the fall? As you in your ministry and what you see, how do we use sex, whether even I'd say outside of marriage, but also in marriage?
I think because we are autonomous, we are also, meaning we are self-ruling. We're basically very selfish people. And so sex for us as fallen people is all about me. I think it's a big reason why we have such a big issue with pornography and things that go with pornography, what we might call solo sex. The fact that it's even an issue, solo sex, that was never in God's mind. It's a very selfish, self-oriented thing. And I think that's what drives everything in our culture, everything in our world having to do with sexuality. It is viewed as a personal, almost appetitive need. And for each individual, fulfilling it is key to his or her flourishing, but doesn't have to do fundamentally with anything outside of you, with really primarily being concerned for the good of another human or for the glory of God. It's all about self.
And would you say that that's particularly seen in, because I know that some folks who might be watching this have maybe experienced sexual abuse or have been abused sexually, or maybe they were an abuser. Is that where you see that kind of coming from, in that type of aspect, in that in terms of how our fallen nature leads to that?
Well, I certainly think abuse is far along on the spectrum, because if you think about, if it's natural to our sinful selves, to our sinful nature, to think of sexuality and use sexuality in a selfish way without regard to other people, that's functioning if you're using pornography, because you're not really caring for, you're not loving the people who are being exploited in the pornography. And that's kind of along that spectrum. But as you go further down that spectrum and you continue to act in ways that are cold-hearted, not concerned at all with the welfare and shalom of other people, you get to the point where you get so hardened in your selfishness that you will actually do what is criminal, abusive things to other people, and it can get quite ugly. And there's many people who have been on the receiving end of that, and the pain and the heartache of being basically treated like an object and having your sexuality stolen and abused in that way, exploited.
And unfortunately, that happens in marriage too, correct?
Absolutely. I think we have this idea, or many people have this idea, that as long as you're married, then you're not sinning sexually. But the truth is, you bring your selfishness into your marriage. And it's very common. In fact, I would say because we're sinners, we all sin in some way in our sexuality in our marriage. But it's also just very common for instance, young men to be basically addicted to pornography and think that, well, I'm going to get married, and when I'm married, that will fix it, because now I'll have a legitimate outlet for my sexual desires. But what happens is his wife becomes his new porn object, like the porn that he's allowed to have. And there are people that actually think of it that way. But what they don't understand is that the way you relate to porn is not God's designed way for sexuality. It's an entirely self-focused, self-worshiping type of interaction. And so you transfer that to the marriage bed, and it's very destructive. And it doesn't solve their pornography problem, because they end up comparing their wife to all the images in their head, and a real person is just not as easy to deal with as an imaginary person. And so she doesn't compare very well, and that causes great problems in marriages.
So I think when we think about marriage, and we think about kind of an abusive sexual relationship, we can think of it primarily men being addicted to pornography and kind of trying to use their wife in that sort of way. From the other side, how have you seen this play out for women in how they might abuse sex in the marriage relationship?
Well, certainly.
And I know this is uncomfortable with two guys talking about this,
and I'm going to.
I know
I'm going to make that excuse, actually, to some extent, because one of the things we do at Harvest USA is we do segregate the direct ministry that we do, that we have women working with women and men working with men, for many reasons. And so on purpose, I'm a little less than an expert on the particular struggles that women have. I think that I would want to stress the similarities more than the differences. I'm not real big on, well, men sin this way and women sin this way. There's a lot of stereotypical things. There might be things in a particular cultural moment that generally women struggle with more than men. Traditionally, people would say men are more visual, women are more relational. That's changing. It's changing. The more that pornography is available, there's a higher and higher percentage of women that are actually getting hooked on visual pornography. So we have to be very careful not to think that women are not susceptible to that. But certainly, in some ways, it has been the case that women are more relational. I think that's one of their strengths. And when we're sinners, even our strengths become weaknesses because we use them to serve ourselves.
Good. Well, thank you. Well, so we've talked about, and just kind of scraped the surface here, about kind of how sin affects this. But there's good news, right?
Yeah,
I mean, Christ has come. Christ has conquered Satan, sin, and death, and now, as you mentioned, lives and reigns in heaven. So how does, thinking through redemption, how has Jesus redeemed our sexuality?
So I think when we're thinking of Jesus redeeming our sexuality, the first most obvious way is that he's redeemed us. You know, he has given us forgiveness. He's given us justification. He's given us his righteousness. He's connected us to him, given us a new heart so that we have a heart that can obey, that can turn from its autonomous selfishness and increasingly learn to love God and love others. So that's the big picture. But then also, because sex is described in the scriptures as a picture of Christ and the church, sex and marriage as a picture of Christ and the church, we can again look at the gospel and say the gospel now gives us a picture of what Jesus is redeeming our sexuality to be. So whereas we might say in the beginning, marriage sex as God designed it was supposed to prepare us to understand Christ, marriage sex, or sex as we know it, is not marriage sex. It's messed up sex. And it doesn't show us Christ. It shows us the opposite. Now Christ comes and actually shows us the gospel, which then should reshape our sexuality. So the revelation kind of was originally would have been sexuality to Christ, but now it's Christ to sexuality because he's redeeming our sexuality.
What is, like, how would you describe redeemed sex? Like what?
So I want to mention now, I had mentioned that sex as designed by God is grounded in permanence. So when we get into looking a little more deeply into the gospel and our union with Christ, and some of those passages, I want to pick out a couple other things. One is that it is bounded by exclusivity, or I might say the holiness principle. And then the other is that it's founded in love. So the first is the exclusivity or the holiness principle. And by holiness, I mean setting apart. So I'm going to go from the gospel to sexuality here in terms of redemption. And in Ephesians 5, when Paul is talking about husbands loving their wives, he says, as Christ loved the church and sanctified her. So he uses the term sanctified or set apart or made holy more than once in that passage. And sanctified, whatever language or meaning we put into that word, sanctification, progressive sanctification, etc., what it literally means is to be set apart, to be put into a category separate from all other things. So in the Old Testament, when a pot or a utensil was set apart for the temple, it was put in a different category. You weren't going to take that spoon or that censer or that pot and use it for, your
making stew.
That's right, for making stew for your right. Backyard get together. Right. It belonged to the Lord. It was set apart for him. And Paul says, again, in that context, that Christ does that for the church. And also husbands are supposed to do that for their wives. And so think about what that does for the gospel. We belong to Christ. He sets us apart. We are, there's a reciprocal nature to that in the scriptures where he says, I've set you apart as belonging to me. You are in a category different from all other people on the face of the earth. Now I expect you also to set me apart and put me in a different category than any other possible God. There's an exclusive faithfulness there. And that's the picture that we get also of sexuality. Redeemed sexuality takes the spouse and sets her or sets him apart, puts in a different category. That means there's one woman in the world for whom sex is even in the picture with regard to me. And that's my wife. And every other woman in the world, whoever she may be, it's not an issue. There's like a strict dividing line. This one belongs to me in that way. And all the others are daughters, sisters, mothers. And that's their relationship. It's something completely different. I'm completely set apart, and her alone, forsaking all others, we say, in a wedding ceremony. And then she also reciprocally gives that to me. And that's a beautiful picture. There's great safety there. So because we are set apart by Christ, we understand that we're saved completely by his grace. He's the one that sets us apart, that makes us holy by his decision, by his work. We don't earn it. We're not going to lose it. We don't compete. We never think, what if he decides at some point, Israel didn't have to say, what if he decides some point that, this particular people group over there has better qualities? Because God made it clear, I didn't set you apart because of your qualities. I set you apart because I set you apart. Right. I've set my love on you. And there's no competition there. Same with a marriage. I set my wife apart. She's in a different category. There's certain things I don't do, not even sexuality, but beyond that, there's marital things that I just don't do with other people. That, if you're looking at pornography, is shattered. Just completely shattered. There is no setting apart at that point. You have made common. Then your sex is assigned to whoever competes well at the moment. And just like it would on our sense of salvation and security in Christ, if we knew we had to compete with other people for his love, it would destroy our sense of security in the gospel. So that does for a wife. When she realizes she's not set apart in a different category by her husband, but she has to compete with not even real women, but these images made up by people. It's incredibly destructive. And you see, a wife at that point gets she doubts herself. She gets depressed. She feels worthless. She's insecure. It's a terribly destructive thing. So in that way, the gospel and our experience of the gospel can reshape us and redeem our sexuality and teach us what it means to set our wives apart as belonging to us exclusively.
So, and vice versa for women, obviously, for their husbands. How does this play out for someone who's not married, right? I mean, so obviously you and I are married, and I understand that in terms of who my wife is and who your wife is. But if I were single,
right?
I mean, how does this work?
Right.
In the fact that, in some regard, as long as another woman is not married to another man,
right,
she's
right.
available.
Right. She's available.
Right. But how does that play? How does this understanding of redeemed sex play out for those who are not married?
Right. I think, and this is difficult because this gets into an experience of sexuality that would have been in its perfection that we don't experience. So we grow up. We all grow up as fallen, sinful people. And that affects our minds and our bodies and everything about us. But I I would suggest that the right way to look at that is this, that it is good for a young man to desire being married. It's good for a man to desire a wife. But I don't think that means that it is good for a man to sexually enjoy, even in imagination, any number of women who might be available or possible. Like, number of young women in his church or in his acquaintance that are potential marriage mates. I think that there needs to be a self-discipline of spirit and heart that says, I want to be married. I want to look to God to provide me with a wife. But the goal from the very beginning is to set one woman apart as that wife. And if you treat multiple young women when you're a young man as if she might be your wife, if you do things with her that you later will say that you would only do with your wife, if you think things about her that you really should only think with your wife, you are violating that exclusivity principle. And that's where I think, young men get into pornography, and they don't realize how much they are handicapping their future marriage, because they are practicing like the way a musician practices to make perfect. I mean, they are enforcing in the way they think about sexuality a non-exclusive way of experiencing it. Imagining anyone who's available, I can just let my imagination run free. And really, they need to work really hard to develop the muscles of exclusivity and holiness and setting apart.
Yeah, a great quote, and I forget exactly who said it. I have it probably in one of my sermons, but especially when I was a youth pastor and was working with students, I would always say the same disciplines in chastity are the same disciplines of exclusivity in marriage.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so
exactly.
I thought it was a really helpful way to think about
right.
About our life as those who are single.
Mm-hmm.
I think you've kind of already been talking about this, but if anything else that you'd like to say about what does it mean to say that the meaning of sex is nothing less than the gospel itself? I read something that you wrote about that.
Yes, that's right. So
you've talked about union with Christ. That's
right, talk about union with Christ, and I think that's where where we're going is that the meaning of sex is nothing less than the gospel itself. Is we've been exploring that in this entire talk, and we talked about how it's grounded in permanence. We talked about how it's bounded by exclusivity or by the holiness principle, being set apart, and we could keep expanding that and say maybe the last one I would mention is that it is it's founded in love. So again, Ephesians 5, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And that's
not an infatuation kind of love,
That's right. That's right. So that love is sacrificial. How did Christ love the church? He gave himself for her.
He was infatuated in a certain sense, right? There was that type of love, right? But that's not what Paul is getting at.
That's right. I mean, when we read the Song of Solomon, and there's something that's like infatuation. I mean, there's an enraptured, very excited type of love, a giddy, that kind of thing is certainly part of the biblical picture, and it's actually astounding. Makes us, I think, a little nervous to think of Christ loving the church in that way. But the fact that the Bible consistently portrays his people as his bride would tell us that is the way God thinks of the situation. And even passages that don't specifically refer to marriage is like in Zephaniah, where God talks about that, of my people, that I will sing over them in delight. The idea of God being so excited to be with us that he would break into song is mind-boggling. And so there is that, that infatuation is partly there. And even I would say in Revelation, where the New Jerusalem comes down as a bride adorned for her husband, made beautiful. It's something that Jesus takes great joy and pleasure in. And I think that's one way that we can see that sexuality in marriage teaches us about Christ and the church. How deeply God enjoys us and loves us and wants to be with us. But also, this love was a self-giving love. And in Ephesians 5, we also see the word nourishing and cherishing. You think of nourishing, you think of someone who is providing food. Cherishing, the word there is actually, keeping warm. It's used in Paul uses it to say that I was with you like a nursing mother with her children. He uses that word for cherish there, and it's like the way you take care of, nourish and take care of your own body. Nourishing, nurturing is an intentional, proactive thing. I don't know very many parents, moms. My mom, for instance, didn't sit in the house and, we're sitting around and waiting until 6, 7, 8 p.m. and we all had to raise our hands and say, Mom, are we going to have supper? Oh, do you want supper? Oh, I guess so. Maybe we should get some food. That's not the way most of us experienced our moms or our dads or whoever it was who spent most of the time preparing for us. I know that's not the way my wife does it. She makes lists. She plans. She has meal plans. She goes to the grocery store with a long list of what she needs to get, budgets it out. That kind of planning and proactive action is the kind of love that's being described in the way Christ takes care of his church. He provides teachers, pastors. He provides the church. He provides nourishment spiritually in the Lord's Supper, the communion. He's made plans to make sure that we get what we need and are built up. And that, in Ephesians 5, is being applied to marriage and sexuality. And that means that we do not accept the culture and the world's lie that what sex is all about is simply responding to stimuli. It's not, you wait until something turns you on and then you follow your appetite. That's not the picture that Scripture gives. It pictures sexuality as intentional and planned out and proactive for the good of building up and nurturing and cherishing that other person. Again, as a picture of what Christ does for us.
So we've looked at kind of the kind of grand overall picture of creation, fall, redemption in terms of our sexuality. You've been kind of talking around this. Is there anything else you'd like to say in terms of like restoration? How does the as we look at that theme throughout Scripture, what is our sexuality maybe being restored to?
Well, I think one of the things that is perhaps somewhat unique about sexuality is that in the biggest picture, our eschatology brings us beyond sexuality. So sexuality, I was saying it was permanent, but it's grounded in permanence for the context of this life, which is the realm of sexuality. But we learn from Christ that in the resurrection, we won't be married. Some of us struggle with that. Like, what? We won't be married? But that's really an incredible thing, because what it's saying, it gives a lot of hope to singles, tremendous hope to singles, because that reminds us that this sexuality was never meant to be an end in itself. It was always meant to point us to that union with Christ that is the real thing, that will be our experience of resurrected sexuality be careful about the way we speak this. This is not any lack of reverence, but this is the way the gospel presents it, that we will be joined, united to Christ. There's a wedding supper of the Lamb that we go to, and this sexuality that we experience physically in this life will be no more. It will be fulfilled in that union with Christ. That will be beyond our wildest dreams in terms of joy and fulfillment.
Well, good. Well, I think the next couple questions I had, I think we've kind of already hit on them in terms of, setting sex apart. What does that mean? Why is it important? We've talked about that. We've talked about sex founded in love in terms of what that means. So I think we've kind of really hit kind of all that I was hoping to in terms of kind of foundational understanding. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't kind of hit on some of the more kind of, quote, hot topics of our day, so to speak, both in the church and in our culture. And so I'd like to spend a few moments just kind of talking about some of those things. And I think, one of the main ones I think most people will be thinking about is homosexuality. How do we as Christians understand homosexuality? Can those who struggle with same-sex attraction be Christians? I mean, all these things that sometimes get kind of thrown out in terms of this sin is the is the sin of all sins, and you can't you can never come back from that, so to speak.
Yeah. So about homosexuality, it's a huge topic that obviously we don't have time to deal with in detail. I would say read the report of the ad interim committee.
Jim was on that committee, by the way. Just I didn't mention that earlier, but yes, it's a great report that they've put together, and that would definitely.
Yeah, I also think it's a great report. I was very pleased with it, and there was a lot of prayer that went into that report, and I believe that those prayers. I had a team of people praying for my involvement and what we were doing, and I'm really pleased with the spirit of the report and the balance, the nuance. I'm really praying that it increases clarity and unity in the truth, and also helps everyone move towards more effective ministry. So that being said, I'll just say that if you start with what is the design is clearly a male and a female. Male and female created he, them. And I think that's consistent in Scripture, and the effort to revise our understanding of Scripture to get rid of that is, frankly, it's somewhat ridiculous. If you have to really want the Scriptures to say something else in order to hear it saying anything else. So it's clearly not the design. Some people find that they struggle with desires, arousal and sexual desires and relational desires that are somewhat marital in their feel towards someone of the same sex. And I think it's important for us to realize that it's not usually an experience that people have of something that's like intentional, deliberate, and thought out. It's more of something that subconsciously comes up in their experience, and they, in the Christian context, usually struggle against mightily. Now, I don't think we can say that they're neutral feelings or that they're not sinful in some sense. I think we can recognize that all of us have sinful feelings, unintentional. There's all kinds of unintentional sins that we commit all the time. There's most of our sin, I would say. I mean, all of us. Most of our sin on a daily basis is stuff that we're not deliberate and intentional about. It's stuff that's deeply ingrained in the way, the grid that we've developed to see the world and react to things. I mean, I sin unintentionally in the car all the time in my reactions, automatic reactions to people and things they do that they have a perfect right to do, but make me angry because I think I'm the king of the world, not just the king of the road. I laugh, but I think it's important. It's very important for us to realize that wrestling with kind of a deep matrix of sinful thoughts and feelings. That's everyone's experience. And someone who experiences a sexuality that is directed in a way that is sinful to act out, whether that be homosexuality or just about any other type of distortion of what God has designed, like, for instance, the distortion of those that think, their sexuality has no limit. Their sexuality has no exclusivity to it. Their sexuality is such that they think any woman in the world is fair game for their sexual pleasure. That also is a gross violation of the way sexuality is designed. I think we can recognize that those thoughts and feelings, as unintentional as they are part of original sin, part of indwelling sin. They're part of what we struggle with. They don't put people in a separate category from all the other Christians and sinners in the world. If they struggle with same-sex attraction, there's specific things that are very difficult to deal with about that. There's suffering that is entailed with that is maybe unique from other types of sinful desires or tendencies. But they're brothers and sisters just like us, that have a particular struggle and many other struggles. And I think that's one of the things I try to often convince my friends who struggle with same-sex attraction that may not be their biggest sin issue. There are plenty of other areas of heart struggle that they need to recognize and be fighting against and mortifying, as we say, in their Christian life.
I think that's extremely helpful and a good reminder for us that we all have a life that, as Paul says, we our old self, right? The old man, still there. Yeah. And a lot of times we don't even know that he's there, right? Help us think a little bit about transgenderism. That's another big topic, a big issue that our culture is wrestling with. I mean, even those who in some sense have been in the past, supportive, are now kind of coming to the realization, well, maybe this actually isn't something we should support. So even secular culture is having this debate and about transgenderism and in the church as well. So how do we think about transgenderism?
It's a difficult topic, and in some ways, if it wasn't politically lumped in, LGBT, the T is transgender. If it wasn't politically lumped in, I'm not even sure if Harvest USA historically would have started dealing with the issue. But it is somewhat on the periphery, and there's lots of ways to approach it. And one is theologically or ideologically. There's a difference in terms of, do you understand the world as created by God, and that He created humans with a binary design, male and female? And of course, in fallen humanity, there's room for physical abnormalities and birth defects, and what we call intersex conditions, where someone presents with some ambiguity. That's all part of the brokenness and fallenness of our fall. And yet a creational worldview sees that binary as binding, as normative, whereas a world that does not believe in a creator God does not have that. And I think what we see ideologically in the transgender movement is grabbing onto a worldview, a view of reality that finds a psychological / I don't know what to call it because it's kind of a Disney heart thing, inside myself sense of identity that is a greater or more preferred source of reality than the physical body. And so the biological sex, what people would call your assigned sex, what the doctor said you were when you were born, is less important than what you find inside yourself. So there's a kind of the ideological battleground there, or conflict where, well, we believe that the world was created by God and God defines it. So in some ways that sets us on that trajectory. But I think there's also a human way of looking at this that's important to realize, and that is people who struggle with these things, there's a lot of suffering involved there. They are, I don't want to just look at them and point my finger and say, see, you're a sinner.
Snap out of it.
That's right, snap out of it, you're a sinner. I need to understand this is a person, an individual who is deeply disappointed, deeply struggling, deeply uncomfortable with their biological sex and all that entails. And it could be for any number of reasons. It could just be that they don't fit, they feel like they don't fit the stereotype of the culture of their particular gender. And so they're just terrified to have to try to fill that role and meet that standard. And they think, they'd be better off doing the other. In many other instances, they associate one particular biological sex with great danger and suffering. I've known of people who suffered horrific abuse. For instance, as a girl, horrific abuse as a girl, to the point where she came to the conclusion she must not be a girl. Really, in other words, she found safety in the idea of maybe I cannot be a girl. If I'm a boy, then I won't, these terrible things won't keep happening to me. They won't do to me what they do to me when I'm a girl. So I say that kind of thing because we have to understand with compassion and not get whipped up into kind of a cultural warfare, everybody is the enemy kind of thing. And we need to be willing to put on eyes of compassion and understand where people are coming from and hear their stories.
That's really good. Thank you. Something that those watching may not be as, have heard of as much or even know what it is, but it's coming. It's part of our cultural moment, and I've even seen articles written about the church and polyamorism. What is that, and how are we as Christians? I think from all we've talked about, it's pretty straightforward, easy answer. But help us to understand what this is and why we as Christians should be, aware.
Well, normalizing multiple partners, and would be what it is. Poly being many, and amorism, many lovers. Again, it's one of those things that I think is rather obvious in terms of if you come at it from a scriptural point of view. That's just not that's a violation of the exclusivity principle. Now, there's some difficulty. Missiologists in the past had to struggle with, cultures that were coming to Christ where you had cultures where there were multiple wives, and how do they deal with that? But I think it's a fairly strong consensus that the design, the way it was in the beginning, was that a man would leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, singular and singular, and that is the picture.
I think that's a good point. But how is polyamorism different than polygamy? Because it is, correct? There are some overlap, but it is different, correct?
It is, because I don't think marriage is necessarily in the picture. I'm not super up on how people talk about polyamory at this point. I know enough about it to know that it's not part of the design. Right. It's not right. But I don't know how people are, in the culture, how they're expressing that. I suspect it's multiple men with multiple women, casual
and
relationships.
Vice versa,
and
maybe one woman with two men, or one woman, it kind of, is across the gamut,
Right,
correct?
right.
In terms
And honestly, dealing in this ministry when I'm speaking with individuals, I almost don't use labels and categories anymore, because the variety in how people are so creative in how they mess up sexuality. There's almost no end to the variety. And I very rarely see, like one category of person, even in homosexuality. There's so many different ways. There's different flavors of homosexuality. I don't want to get into the specifics,
Sure.
but so if someone comes to me and says, well, I'm into polyamory, well, I will deal with whatever variety that particular person is dealing with. I mean, I've had people tell me that they're asexual, not bisexual, not homosexual, not heterosexual, asexual. And so, okay, so how do I help them with that? So yeah, the categories are less important.
Good, that's helpful. Before we end, and I think we've kind of touched on this a bit, but I'd like you to maybe go a little bit more in depth in this. First, is sexual sin unforgivable?
No. No.
And I wanted to say that because, and I wanted to hear you say that because I think sometimes
Yeah.
that's been a lie, right? That
Yeah.
we've
Right.
been told or
That's
tell
right.
ourselves, or as I say to a lot of people, I say, the devil is the father of lies, and
Right.
would love us to think that there's something in our lives that's unforgivable, correct?
Right. Ask the woman caught in adultery. Ask Mary Magdalene. Ask Gomer. Ask Israel. Yes, Israel. Ask Judah. If you know the story of Judah and Tamar, it's pretty sordid stuff. Certainly, it's not unforgivable. At the same time, I will say, it is a big deal. Sexuality is a big deal, and I think it's a big deal because it is intended to be a picture of the gospel. And so when God's people, when individuals in God's people really warp sexuality, they are warping something that is supposed to be a holy picture of Christ. And so it's significant. And I think the Apostle Paul makes that clear in his writings as well, that one of the ways that the church has to strive to be different than the world is in the area of sexuality. And I think the way that I would describe to people how this is to be a big deal, it's the difference between, let's say you're at I could dare to be political here. Let's say that you are at a Joe Biden rally, and someone walks in with a red MAGA hat, and you imagine the reaction. Okay, that's reaction number one. And then reaction number two, you are at a physician's oncology convention, so a bunch of cancer docs, and someone walks in with an obvious melanoma mole on his face, and there's an immediate reaction. Those two things. The first one is disgust, judgment, hatred, get him out of here. The other one is a strong reaction, but it's a reaction of, oh my goodness, that is dangerous. That person needs help. We need to do something now and make sure that person understands the danger that he's in. The second one is the attitude, the seriousness with which the church needs to take sexuality, not the first one. Too often, we've taken the first one. As soon as we realize there's a sexual sinner in our midst, we think, get him out of here. Not what we should do. We should instead say, that one needs special attention.
So that means that they're not too far from God.
Absolutely. Right.
Doesn't mean that they're not a believer if they struggle with
Right.
any form of sexual sin.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that God loves them any less.
Right.
Correct? Good. Just wanted to clarify that.
Absolutely.
And because I think, as you've probably experienced and I've experienced in my pastoral ministry, I think those are actually things that people believe. Right?
Yeah, yeah. I think that is one of the it's one of the consequences of the fact that we don't talk about these things in the church, or if we talk about them, we only talk about them with our fingers pointed outside the walls at, how terrible the world is. If that's all we do, then nobody is telling anybody else what they're struggling with. And every individual person sitting in the pew, not only are they thinking nobody else struggles with this, but the only time they hear it spoken about with a condemning tone about the enemies of the church outside our walls. And they're sitting there, that one person sitting there in the pew thinking, that's me. I'm the enemy. If anyone in this church knew what I struggle with, or even what I do, it would be clear that I don't belong here. And the irony is, there are countless other people sitting all around you who are thinking and feeling the same thing.
Absolutely. Well, this has been obviously, as much as I said I wanted you to come because I wanted to do a little bit deeper dive, which I think we did more than I could have done in a sermon. Still only scraped the surface. Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share before we close our time together?
I just want to, as a husband, I want to give a special challenge to the husbands to seek to learn from Christ. What does it mean to love intentionally and sacrificially? To plan, not to think that you receive sexuality, but that you plan how to build up and strengthen and adorn your wife in a way that is different from any other person, any other woman in the whole world. I just want to challenge you to grow in that as married men. Do not assume that because you're married, you've got it down. But pursue a sexuality that resembles more and more the way Christ loves you and has saved you.
That's really helpful. Finally, for those who may be struggling in any form or fashion that we've touched on or haven't touched on, what would you say to them?
I would say the solution to any struggle in this area is not first to focus on that struggle, but it's to put your eyes on Christ, to get to know Jesus better, to see him more clearly. And I would say that the theme verse of my efforts to help and disciple those who are struggling is from 1 John 3. When we see him, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. And I'm more and more convinced that our sanctification in any area, especially this area, is not driven first by our attention at that sin, but by our seeing Jesus. The more we see him for who he is and are enraptured by him and praise him and love him, the more we are changed. So look to Jesus and seek him out.
That's beautiful. And then, I guess I said finally, but finally, for those who have experienced distorted sexuality through abuse, what would you say to them?
God is an avenger, and God is a rescuer. He knows. He has a much bigger plan, and he has healing available.
Well, Jim, thank you so much. This has really been helpful for me personally, and hope you as well, who get the chance to watch this, I hope it's helpful for you, and pray that for those who do struggle, particularly in this area of life. I mean, I think, as you mentioned, we all in some form or fashion struggle with our sexuality. But for those of you who have a particular deep struggle here, I hope this has been helpful, will maybe help you to see that there is hope in the future. And for those of you who, this is not something that is maybe on your mind all the time, as followers of Christ, hopefully this also has helped you to see your own need in this area, but also to see how we as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ care for others, both in the church and outside the church, and how we can seek the good of one another as we follow Christ together. So, Jim, thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Hopefully, we can have you back again sometime, maybe when there are actually people in the room.
Yeah.
Good. So, for those of you can find information about Harvest USA.
HarvestUSA.org.
Great. And there's I think a link on there to our Pittsburgh office, correct, that they can find information directly for those of you who are here locally. But if you're watching and you're not here locally, there are resources and things available for those that don't have a local Harvest office as well, right?
Yep.
Great. Well, thanks again, and look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.
All right. Thanks, John.
Thank
Bye.
you.